They said the storm would take anyone foolish enough to walk into it alone, but no one warned her it would lead her straight into him. The wind howled like something alive, tearing through Clara Whitmore's thin wool coat as snow stung her cheeks in sharp, relentless bursts, each breath burning her lungs as she stumbled forward through the blinding white, her boots sinking inches into the frozen ground with every desperate step, the world around her reduced to nothing but cold and silence and the faint, terrifying awareness that if she stopped moving, even for a moment, she might never move again. She had miscalculated the distance, trusted a sky that turned without warning, and now the road had vanished beneath layers of snow, leaving her alone in a wilderness that seemed determined to erase her existence entirely. Her fingers numb despite clutching her small leather case against her chest, as if it alone tethered her to purpose, to survival, to the fragile thread of a life that had never offered her mercy. Just as her vision began to blur at the edges, just as her knees threatened to give way beneath her, a shape emerged through the storm, dark, solid, impossible, lanterns flickering like distant stars through the chaos, a carriage standing still where nothing should have been, as if waiting, as if it had always been meant for her. She didn't think, didn't question, because desperation had already stripped her of caution, and with trembling hands she reached the door, pulled it open, and climbed inside, collapsing onto the seat with a gasp that shook her entire body as the storm was suddenly cut off, reduced to a muffled roar beyond thick walls. For one fleeting second, relief flooded her, warmth brushing against her frozen skin, the faint scent of leather and smoke grounding her back into the world of the living, until she lifted her eyes and realized she was not alone. Across from her sat a man who did not move, did not speak, his tall frame half-shadowed by the dim lantern light. His presence so still it felt carved from the same stone as whatever world existed beyond the storm. And when his eyes finally met hers, steel gray and unyielding, something in her chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Clara straightened instinctively, her breath catching as the weight of his gaze settled over her, not curious, not surprised, but assessing, as if he were measuring not who she was, but whether she belonged in the space she had just invaded. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until the carriage lurched forward, wheels crunching over snow that should have made travel impossible. And still he said nothing, his gloved hand resting lightly against the armrest, controlled, composed, as though storms and strangers were inconveniences he neither welcomed nor feared. It was only when the distant outline of towering stone walls began to rise through the storm, jagged against the white sky like the bones of something long buried, that Clara felt the first true flicker of unease replace her desperation, because whatever sanctuary she had stumbled into did not feel like rescue at all. The iron gates groaned open as the carriage rolled forward, their sound swallowed almost instantly by the storm. Yet Clara felt it echo somewhere deep within her chest, as if she had just crossed a threshold that would not easily be undone. The man across from her had not spoken a single word since she entered, but his presence filled the narrow space with a quiet authority that made every movement feel observed, measured. And when the carriage finally came to a stop beneath the towering archway of the castle, he stepped out first without offering a hand, his boots striking the stone with a steady, unhurried rhythm that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the wind still clawing at the world beyond. Clara hesitated only a moment before following, her legs unsteady, her breath catching as she looked up at the structure before her, its high windows dark, its walls rising at least 3 stories into the storm-darkened sky, the entire place seeming less like a home and more like something preserved in time, untouched and unwilling to welcome the living. Inside, the heavy doors closed behind them with a finality that silenced the storm completely, leaving only the faint crackle of distant firelight and the soft echo of footsteps across marble floors. And for a moment Clara simply stood there, her senses struggling to adjust to the sudden stillness, the warmth that brushed her frozen skin feeling almost unreal. "You will remain here until the roads are passable," the Duke said at last, his voice low and controlled, each word precise, as though carefully measured before being allowed into the air. And though the statement was polite in form, there was no mistaking that it was not a suggestion. Clara inclined her head, her fingers tightening slightly around the handle of her case as she found her voice, steady despite the tremor still lingering in her body. "Thank you, Your Grace. I will not be any trouble." But something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not softened, not warmed, but sharpened, as though the idea of trouble was not something he dismissed lightly. A servant appeared as if summoned by the silence itself, moving with quiet efficiency to take her coat, and Clara allowed it. Though she felt oddly exposed without its thin protection, her gaze drawn despite herself to the vast hall stretching out before her, where tall stone columns cast long shadows beneath dim chandeliers, and along the far wall hung a single portrait, large and commanding, its surface concealed beneath a dark veil that seemed too deliberate to be decorative. She looked at it only for a moment, but that was enough, because she felt it then, the weight in the air, something unspoken yet unmistakable, a presence not of a person, but of a memory that had not faded. "Do not wander," the Duke added, his tone unchanged, though the words landed with a quiet finality that made her glance back at him, his eyes no longer on her, but fixed briefly on that veiled portrait before he turned away as if it held nothing at all. Clara nodded, though she sensed the warning reached far beyond the walls of the castle, and as she was led down a corridor lined with closed doors and flickering candlelight, her footsteps soft against the polished floor, she could not shake the feeling that she had not simply been given shelter from the storm, but had stepped into something far colder, far deeper, and far more dangerous than the wind she had left behind. The room they gave her was far too large for a single guest, its high ceiling disappearing into shadow while the fire in the hearth flickered with a quiet persistence that did little to soften the cold weight of the stone walls. And as Clara stood just inside the doorway, her gloved fingers still wrapped around the handle of her worn case, she felt something she could not name settle over her shoulders, not fear, not yet, but a quiet awareness that this place did not easily accept the presence of strangers. The maid who had escorted her bowed slightly before leaving without unnecessary words, the door closing with a soft but final sound that left Clara alone with the silence. And for a moment, she did not move, listening, as if expecting the castle itself to breathe, but it did not. It only waited. Slowly, she crossed the room, her steps careful against the polished floor, setting her case down near the bed that seemed far too pristine, as though rarely used. And when she removed her gloves, she noticed how her hands still trembled slightly, not from the cold this time, but from something quieter, something that lingered beneath the surface of everything she had seen since stepping through those doors. She moved closer to the fire, holding her fingers toward the warmth, watching the faint color return to her skin. And it was only then, in that fragile moment of stillness, that the memory of the veiled portrait returned to her mind, unbidden, persistent, and she found herself turning toward the window as if to escape it, though beyond the glass there was nothing but darkness and snow pressed against the world like a barrier that would not lift. Somewhere in the distance, a door closed, the sound echoing faintly through the corridors, followed by footsteps that faded just as quickly, reminding her that she was not alone in this place, even if it felt as though she had been placed at its very edge, separate from whatever life might exist within its walls. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself, and began to remove her coat fully, draping it carefully over the back of a chair, her movements deliberate, controlled, as they had always been, because composure was the only thing she had ever truly owned. Time passed in quiet fragments, measured only by the shifting light of the fire and the soft ticking of a clock somewhere unseen, until at last a knock sounded at the door, gentle but precise, and when Clara opened it, she found a tray waiting, placed neatly in the hands of a servant who offered no more than a polite nod before departing, leaving her once again alone with the silence. She carried the tray inside, setting it down with care, but her appetite had long since been dulled by the weight of everything pressing in around her, and though she forced herself to eat a few bites, it felt more like obligation than comfort. Later, as the fire burned lower and the shadows deepened, Clara moved toward the door, her hand hovering briefly over the handle as she recalled the Duke's words, "Do not wander," and yet something within her, quiet but insistent, urged her forward, not out of defiance, but out of a need to understand the place that had already begun to settle into her thoughts. The corridor beyond was dimly lit, the candles spaced far enough apart that darkness filled the spaces between, and as she stepped out, her footsteps soft and cautious, she felt that same strange stillness wrap around her once more, as though the castle were listening. And then, almost without realizing how far she had come, she found herself standing at the edge of the great hall once again, her gaze drawn, as if by something unseen, to the veiled portrait that stood unmoving in the distance. She did not intend to approach it, not truly, but her feet carried her forward all the same, each step measured, each breath quieter than the last, until she stood only a few feet away, the dark fabric hanging motionless before her, concealing whatever lay beneath. And for a moment, she simply stared at it, her heart beating a little faster, a quiet question forming in her mind, before her hand lifted, almost of its own accord, reaching toward the edge of the veil just as a voice, low and unmistakably close, broke through the silence behind her. "I would not do that." And Clara froze, her fingers stopping inches from the fabric, the warmth of the fire gone, replaced by the sudden awareness that she had stepped into something she did not yet understand, and that the man behind her had been watching far longer than she realized. Clara did not turn immediately, her hand suspended in the cold air inches from the dark veil, her breath caught somewhere between instinct and restraint, and for a moment the silence stretched so tightly that even the faint crackle of distant fire seemed to vanish, leaving only the quiet awareness of the man standing behind her. When she finally lowered her hand, it was slow, deliberate, as though any sudden movement might disturb something fragile and unseen, and only then did she turn, meeting the Duke's gaze once more, his expression unchanged, his presence as composed and immovable as the stone walls surrounding them. "I apologize, Your Grace," she said softly, her voice steady despite the faint pulse in her throat. "I did not intend to overstep." But his eyes did not leave her, not immediately. And in that pause there was something unreadable, not anger, not quite, but something closer to caution, as if the line she had approached was one that had been drawn long before she arrived. "Intent does not change consequence," he replied, his tone low, controlled, each word measured with the same precision she had come to expect, and though the words were not harsh, they settled heavily in the space between them, a quiet boundary reinforced. Clara inclined her head again, accepting the correction without argument, because she understood too well the cost of crossing lines that did not belong to her. Yet even as she stepped back, putting distance between herself and the veiled portrait, she could not ignore the way his gaze shifted briefly toward it, as though drawn despite himself, before returning to her with that same steady intensity. "You should rest," he added after a moment, though it sounded less like concern and more like a decision already made, and Clara nodded, turning toward the corridor, her footsteps soft against the floor as she began to walk away. But she felt it then, unmistakable, the weight of his attention lingering even after she had passed him, following her like a shadow that refused to fall behind. She did not look back, not until she reached the edge of the hall, where something compelled her to pause, just for a second, and when she did glance over her shoulder, she found him standing exactly where she had left him, his figure still, his gaze no longer on her, but fixed once again on the veiled portrait, his posture unchanged, yet something in the stillness around him felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened with memory. Clara turned away quickly, the image settling into her thoughts more deeply than she intended, and as she made her way back through the dim corridor, the candles flickering faintly as she passed, she became aware of how quiet the castle truly was. Not peaceful, not restful, but restrained, as though every sound had been deliberately softened, contained within walls that had witnessed too much and chosen to remember it all. When she returned to her room, she closed the door gently behind her, leaning against it for just a moment, her eyes closing briefly as she drew in a slow breath, steadying herself. Yet even in the relative warmth of the fire, she could not shake the feeling that she had brushed against something far more fragile than she had realized, something not meant to be disturbed, and yet impossible to ignore. Across the hall, far beyond her sight, Sebastian Blackwood remained standing before the portrait, the silence pressing in around him as it always did, familiar, unyielding, and for a long moment he did nothing, said nothing, until at last his hand lifted, not to remove the veil, never that, but to rest briefly against the edge of the frame. His fingers still, as though the contact alone carried weight, and, though no one was there to hear it, his voice broke the silence in the faintest whisper, "Not again." Before he stepped back, the distance between himself and the past restored, at least in appearance, though something within him had shifted in a way he could not yet name, something that had begun the moment a stranger stepped into his carriage and refused, without even knowing it, to look away. Clara did not sleep easily that night, though the bed was warm and the fire had been carefully tended, because the silence within the castle was not the kind that invited rest, it was the kind that listened. And as she lay beneath the heavy covers, her eyes tracing the faint shadows along the ceiling, she found her thoughts returning again and again to the moment in the hall, to the way his voice had stopped her without force, to the way his presence seemed to fill the space even in stillness. She turned slightly, drawing the blanket closer around her shoulders, but the warmth did little to quiet the unease that had settled beneath her ribs, not fear exactly, but awareness, as though she had stepped into a story already in motion, one that had begun long before her arrival and would continue long after she left, if she ever truly left at all, somewhere deep within the castle. A clock chimed softly, the sound echoing through corridors she had not yet seen, marking the passing of time in a place where time itself seemed to linger, unwilling to move forward. Eventually, exhaustion overcame thought, and Clara drifted into a shallow sleep, though even then the stillness did not release her entirely. Her dreams touched by fragments she could not quite understand, shadows of hallways, the faint outline of a portrait, a voice that never raised itself, yet could not be ignored. When morning came, it arrived not with sunlight, but with a muted gray filtering through the frost-touched windows, the storm still pressing against the world outside, relentless, unbroken, and for a moment Clara remained still, listening, as though confirming that the night had not been imagined, that the castle remained exactly as it had been, quiet and watchful. She rose slowly, dressing with the same care she applied to everything, smoothing each fold of fabric as though it might restore some sense of control. And when she stepped into the corridor, the air was no warmer than before, the candles still burning low, their light barely reaching the edges of the walls. She followed the faint scent of breakfast toward a smaller dining room, where a table had been set with understated precision, and though she had expected to be alone, she paused at the threshold when she saw him already there, seated at the far end, a cup of untouched coffee before him, his gaze fixed not on the table, but on the window beyond, where the storm continued its quiet assault. Clara hesitated only briefly before entering, her footsteps soft, measured, and when he finally turned his head, acknowledging her presence with a single glance, she inclined her head politely, taking her place without invitation, because it was clear that invitation was not something he offered lightly. The silence between them was not uncomfortable in the usual sense, but it carried weight, a quiet tension that did not need words to exist, and for several moments neither of them spoke, the faint clink of porcelain the only sound breaking the stillness as Clara poured herself tea, her hands steady despite the awareness of his gaze returning to her more than once. "Did you rest?" he asked at last, his voice low, almost distant, as though the question had been considered before being spoken, and Clara met his gaze briefly before answering. "Yes, Your Grace," though they both knew it was not entirely true. Something in his expression shifted then, not disbelief, but recognition, as though he understood more than she had said, and for a brief moment, the silence between them felt different, less like a barrier and more like something shared, though neither acknowledged it. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the glass, the storm refusing to ease, and as Clara lowered her gaze to her cup, she realized with quiet certainty that the world beyond those walls was not the only thing that had been sealed away, and that whatever remained within this castle had begun, slowly and without permission, to reach toward her in return. The storm showed no mercy by midday, the wind pressing against the tall windows with a steady insistence that made the glass tremble faintly in its frame, and Clara found herself drawn to it despite the chill, her fingers resting lightly against the cold surface as she stared out into the endless white, where sky and ground had long since blurred into one indistinguishable void, a world erased, simplified into silence and distance. Behind her, the castle remained as it had been since her arrival, quiet, restrained, every sound softened as though absorbed by the stone itself. And yet the longer she remained within it, the more she became aware of subtle shifts, small indications of life that revealed themselves not through noise, but through presence. A door opened somewhere unseen, footsteps that passed and faded, the faint movement of air in corridors that seemed too still to breathe. She turned away from the window at last, drawing her shawl more tightly around her shoulders, and allowed herself to move beyond the narrow path she had followed since morning, not wandering aimlessly, but with a quiet purpose that surprised even her, as though something within her had already begun to map the space, to understand it in ways she could not yet explain. The corridor stretched ahead, lined with closed doors and dim light, each step carrying her deeper into the heart of the castle. And though she remembered his warning, it no longer held the same weight it had the night before, not because she intended to defy it, but because curiosity, once awakened, did not easily return to silence. She paused at the entrance to a smaller sitting room, its door slightly ajar, and after a brief hesitation, she pushed it open, the hinges making no sound as if even they had learned not to disturb the stillness. And inside she found a space unlike the rest, warmer in its design, though no less quiet, shelves lined with books, a chair positioned near an unlit fireplace, and on a small table beside it, a single object that drew her attention without effort, a music box, delicate and intricately carved, its surface untouched by dust. Clara stepped closer, her fingers hovering just above it, not quite touching, as though she understood instinctively that some things within this place were not meant to be disturbed. Yet the silence around it felt different, less guarded, more waiting. She hesitated only a moment longer before gently lifting the lid, and the soft, fragile melody that followed seemed to breathe life into the room itself, its notes delicate, almost hesitant, as though unsure they were still welcome in a place that had forgotten how to hold them. The sound lingered in the air, weaving through the quiet, and for the first time since her arrival, Clara felt something shift, not in the castle, but within herself, a sense of connection she could not name, as if she had stepped into a memory not her own. She did not hear him enter, not at first, but she felt it, the subtle change in the air, the presence that announced itself without sound. And when she turned, her hand instinctively lowering from the music box, she found him standing at the doorway, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed not on her, but on the small object now resting open in her hand. The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more immediate, and for a moment Clara thought she had crossed another line, one she could not step back from. But when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she expected, stripped of its earlier edge that has not been opened in years, and though the words were simple, they carried something beneath them, something fragile, as though the past he kept so carefully contained had been disturbed not by intrusion, but by something far more dangerous, something gentle enough to reach where nothing else had been allowed. Clara's fingers slowly lowered the lid of the music box, the delicate melody fading into silence as if it had never dared to exist at all, and for a moment she could not find the right words, not because she did not understand the boundary she had crossed, but because the quiet in the room felt different now, heavier, as though something fragile had been stirred awake. "I am sorry," she said at last, her voice soft but steady, her gaze meeting his without hesitation. And though the apology was genuine, it carried no fear, only acknowledgement, the kind that did not retreat, but remained present, and that, more than anything, seemed to hold his attention. Sebastian did not respond immediately, his eyes lingering on the music box for a fraction longer before shifting back to her. And in that brief silence there was a flicker of something beneath his composed exterior, something that had not yet hardened into distance. "It was not meant to be heard again," he said quietly, though the words lacked the sharp edge she had expected, and instead carried a restraint that suggested the decision had not been made lightly, but repeatedly, over time. Clara inclined her head slightly, her hands now resting still at her sides. "Then perhaps it was waiting," she replied before she could stop herself, the words escaping not as defiance, but as observation, and the moment they settled between them, she felt the weight of them, unsure whether she had overstepped once more. His expression did not change, not visibly, yet something in his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if the certainty he carried had been nudged, not broken, but questioned, and for a long second neither of them moved, the air between them holding something unspoken that neither seemed willing to name. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls with renewed force, a low, distant sound that filled the silence without breaking it, and Clara became aware of the contrast, the storm raging just beyond the stone, while within these walls, something quieter, far more contained, was beginning to shift. Sebastian stepped into the room at last, his movements measured, controlled as always, yet closer now than before, and though he did not approach the music box, his presence filled the space in a way that made Clara acutely aware of the distance between them, not vast, but deliberate, as though each step he took had been chosen with care. "You should not concern yourself with things that do not belong to you," he said, his voice returning to its familiar calm. But the words did not carry the same finality they once had, and Clara met his gaze once more, not challenging, not yielding, simply present. "I understand," she answered, and she did. Yet something within her refused to dismiss what she had felt in that moment, the quiet life that had stirred within the melody, the way it had changed the room, even if only briefly. Another silence followed, but this one was different, less rigid, less defined, as though the boundaries between them had shifted ever so slightly, not erased, but no longer as absolute as they had been when she first arrived. At last, Sebastian turned away, his gaze moving toward the window, where the storm continued without pause, and for a moment he stood there, his back to her, the distance restored in appearance if not entirely in truth. "The storm will not clear by nightfall," he said, though the words seemed almost secondary, an observation rather than a dismissal, and Clara nodded, though he could not see it, her eyes lingering on him just a moment longer before she stepped back, giving him the space he had reclaimed. Yet as she moved toward the door, she carried with her the quiet certainty that something within this place, something within him, had shifted, not enough to be named, but enough to be felt, like the first crack in ice that had long refused to break. Clara left the room with quiet steps, the door closing softly behind her as though even the wood understood the need for restraint. And yet the silence that followed her into the corridor no longer felt the same as before, because something within it had shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a breath drawn after years of stillness. She walked slowly, not out of hesitation, but because the castle seemed to reveal itself differently now, the dim light along the walls no longer oppressive, but watchful, as if aware of her presence in a way it had not been before. And as she passed the tall windows lining the corridor, she noticed how the storm outside had deepened, the snow falling thicker, heavier, pressing itself against the glass in relentless waves, as though the world beyond had been entirely erased, leaving only this place suspended in time. She paused briefly, her reflection faintly visible in the window, pale against the darkness, and for a moment she studied it, not in vanity, but in quiet recognition, because she no longer looked like the woman who had stumbled blindly into the carriage hours before. There was something steadier in her gaze now, something that had begun to take root in the silence she had entered. Somewhere behind her, a door opened, then closed again, the sound soft but distinct. And though she did not turn, she knew it was him, not by sight, but by the subtle shift in the air, the presence that did not need announcement. She continued walking, her steps measured, until she reached the curve of the corridor where the light grew dimmer, and it was there that his voice reached her again, not close, not distant, but carried with the same quiet authority that had first stopped her in the hall. "You do not follow instructions easily." And Clara slowed, turning slightly to face him, her expression calm, her posture composed. "I did not intend to disobey," she answered, her voice even, neither defensive nor apologetic. And for a moment he simply regarded her, as though weighing not her words, but the truth within them. The space between them was not large, yet it felt deliberate, as though both understood without speaking that distance held meaning here, that it was not to be crossed without consequence. And yet the silence that followed was no longer sharp. It had softened, just enough to allow something else to exist within it. "Curiosity is rarely without cost," he said after a moment, his tone unchanged, though the words carried less warning than before, more observation than command, and Clara inclined her head slightly, considering. "So is silence," she replied quietly, and this time the words lingered differently, not as challenge, but as truth, simple and unguarded. And for the first time since she had met him, something in his expression shifted in a way she could not fully interpret, not softened, not broken, but altered, as though a thought had taken root where none had been allowed before. The wind surged against the walls again, a low, distant force that reminded them both of the world beyond, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, the silence settling once more. But it no longer felt empty. It held something now, something neither had named, but both had begun to recognize. At last, Sebastian stepped aside, not in dismissal, but in quiet allowance, and Clara understood the gesture for what it was, not permission exactly, but the absence of refusal, and as she moved past him, her step steady, she felt his gaze follow her only briefly before it lifted, returning to the corridor, to the silence, to the place that had begun, slowly and without intention, to change in her presence, just as she had begun to change within it. By evening, the storm had grown quieter, not weaker, but deeper, its fury no longer loud against the walls but steady and unrelenting, as though it had settled into its purpose. And within the castle, that same quiet persistence seemed to echo, filling the corridors with a stillness that no longer felt empty, but watchful, aware. Clara stood once more near the tall window at the end of the hall, her fingers lightly brushing the frost along the glass, tracing patterns she did not consciously form, her thoughts no longer scattered but drawn inward, circling the moments of the day with a clarity that unsettled her more than the storm ever could. She had not meant to linger here, not meant to step beyond the role of a temporary guest, yet with each passing hour, the distance between her and this place seemed to shift, not outward, but inward, as though she had crossed a boundary she had not seen. Behind her, the castle remained quiet, yet no longer distant, and when she turned, it was not surprise that met her as she saw him again, standing several feet away, his presence as inevitable now as the silence itself. "You seek the windows often," Sebastian said, his voice low, not accusing, but observant, and Clara met his gaze with the same calm she had held since morning, though there was something deeper in it now, something that did not retreat so easily. "They remind me there is still a world beyond these walls," she answered, her words soft, yet steady, and for a moment his expression remained unchanged, but something in his eyes shifted, not visibly, but in the way they lingered on her just a fraction longer than before. "And you find that comforting?" he asked, though it did not sound like a question, and Clara paused, her gaze returning briefly to the storm outside, the endless white pressing against the glass like a barrier between what was and what had been. "I find it necessary," she replied, and this time the silence that followed was not tense, but thoughtful, as though the words had reached a place neither of them had expected. He stepped closer then, not enough to close the distance entirely, but enough to alter it, to make the space between them feel less like separation and more like something chosen. And for a moment they stood there, not speaking, not moving, yet not turning away either, the quiet around them holding something fragile, something that had begun to form without either of them willing it. "You do not belong here," he said at last, the words simple, but not dismissive, and Clara inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the truth in them. "No," she agreed, her voice unchanged, "but neither do you." And the moment the words left her, she felt the shift, subtle but unmistakable, not in the room, but in him. His gaze held hers, no longer distant, no longer entirely guarded, and for the first time since she had entered his world, the silence between them did not feel like something he controlled, but something they shared. Outside, the storm pressed on, indifferent, unending, but within the castle, something had begun to move, not loud, not visible, but real, like the slow thaw of something long buried beneath ice that had once seemed permanent. And as Clara lowered her gaze at last, the faintest awareness settled within her, quiet but certain, that whatever had begun here would not end when the storm did, because it was no longer the storm that held her within these walls, but something far more difficult to escape. The night settled slowly over the castle, not with darkness alone, but with a deepening quiet that seemed to press gently against every wall, every corridor, every unspoken thought, and Clara found herself unable to return to her room, not because she feared the silence, but because she no longer felt separate from it, as though something within her had begun to answer the stillness instead of resisting it. The fire in the great hall had been lit, its soft glow casting long shadows across the stone floor, and she stood near its edge, her hands lightly clasped before her, watching the flames shift and rise with a rhythm that felt almost human, steady, patient, alive. She did not hear him approach this time, but she sensed it, the same subtle change in the air that had begun to feel familiar, and when she turned, she found Sebastian standing closer than he had before, not near enough to intrude, but near enough that the distance between them no longer felt like a barrier, only a pause. "You have not returned to your room," he said, his voice quiet, yet carrying easily through the space. And Clara met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, though something softer had begun to settle beneath it. "Nor have you," she replied, and for a moment the faintest trace of something crossed his features, not quite a smile, but something less distant than what she had first seen. The firelight reflected in his eyes, softening the steel gray just enough to reveal what lay beneath. Not warmth, not yet, but something that had once known it. He stepped closer, the movement unhurried, as though it had not been planned, and for a brief second Clara became aware of the quiet between their breaths, the way the space seemed to hold them both in place without force. "There was a time," he said after a moment, his voice lower now, almost as though it belonged more to the fire than to him, "when this hall did not feel so empty," and the words lingered, not heavy, but unfinished, as though the rest of the thought had been buried long before it could be spoken aloud. Clara did not interrupt, did not fill the silence that followed, because she understood instinctively that what he had offered was not meant to be explained, only acknowledged, and so she simply remained where she was, her presence quiet, steady, unintrusive. Outside, the wind shifted again, softer now, though no less persistent, brushing against the walls with a sound that felt distant, almost irrelevant compared to the stillness. Within the music box, she said gently after a moment, not as a question, but as a continuation of something that had not yet ended, and his gaze flickered briefly, not away from her, but inward, as though the memory it carried had not been touched in years. "It belonged to her," he answered. And though the words were simple, they carried a weight that settled between them without needing explanation. Clara lowered her gaze slightly, not in avoidance, but in understanding, because some things did not need to be seen to be felt, and when she looked back at him, there was no pity in her expression, only recognition, quiet and unwavering. "You keep it closed," she said softly, and this time his response came after a longer pause. "Some things are meant to remain that way." Yet even as he spoke, there was something in his voice that no longer sounded certain, as though the truth he had held on to for so long had begun, slowly and without permission, to loosen its grip. The fire shifted, casting new shadows along the walls, and in that flickering light, Clara saw it, not clearly, not fully, but enough, the outline of a man who had once known something more than silence, something more than restraint. And though he stood before her now unchanged in form, she understood with quiet certainty that something within him had already begun to move, not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably, like a door that had been closed for years, now opening just enough to let the smallest trace of light return. The fire had burned lower by the time silence reclaimed the hall, its glow now softer, more fragile, casting shadows that seemed less like darkness and more like memory stretched thin across stone, and Clara remained where she stood, not out of uncertainty, but because something within the moment resisted ending, as though movement itself might disturb what had quietly begun to form between them. Sebastian had not stepped away, though the distance between them remained, deliberate as always, yet no longer impenetrable, and as the last of his words settled into the air, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because what had been revealed did not require immediate response. Outside, the storm had shifted again, its presence now quieter, almost distant, as though the world beyond the castle had begun to release its hold, though the cold remained pressed against the glass. A reminder that not everything yielded so easily. Clara moved at last, slowly, not toward the door, but toward the fire, her steps measured, her hands extending slightly toward the warmth, and for a moment she allowed herself the simple act of standing there, of existing without expectation, without the weight of roles or distance, and though she did not turn, she was aware of him still watching, not with the sharp scrutiny of before, but with something quieter, something that lingered rather than assessed. "You do not speak of her often," she said after a moment, her voice gentle, not probing, but acknowledging what had already been offered. And the silence that followed was longer this time, not tense, but considered, as though the question had not been rejected, only weighed. When he finally answered, his voice was lower than before, less guarded. There was nothing left to say, and the words might have ended there, but something within them shifted, not outwardly, but in the way they were held, as though they no longer carried the certainty they once had. Clara turned slightly then, enough to meet his gaze, and though she did not step closer, the space between them felt different, not reduced, but altered, as if it no longer served the same purpose. Or perhaps there was too much, she replied softly, and this time the silence that followed was not empty. It held something fragile, something that neither of them seemed willing to break, because within it lay a truth that had not yet fully taken form. Sebastian's gaze did not waver, but something in it changed, not dramatically, not visibly, but in the way it held her there, no longer distant, no longer entirely removed, and for the first time, since she had entered his world, there was no immediate retreat behind control, no quick dismissal of what had been said. The fire shifted again, its light catching briefly in his eyes, and in that moment, Clara saw it more clearly, not the man he had been, but the space where that man had once existed, still present, still waiting beneath the surface he had built so carefully. "You should rest," he said at last, though the words lacked their former distance, carrying instead a quiet acknowledgement of the moment that had passed between them, and Clara inclined her head, accepting not the instruction, but the understanding within it, and as she turned to leave, her steps soft against the floor, she felt it again, that subtle shift in the air, the sense that something had been set into motion, not by force, not by intention, but by presence alone. Behind her, Sebastian remained where he stood, the firelight fading slowly around him, and though he did not move, did not speak again, the silence that surrounded him was no longer the same, because for the first time in years, it no longer belonged entirely to him. Morning did not arrive so much as it revealed itself slowly, the darkness lifting in gradual shades of gray that softened the edges of the world beyond the windows. And when Clara opened her eyes, it was not the silence that greeted her, but a difference within it, something lighter, less absolute, as though the castle itself had exhaled during the night. She remained still for a moment, her gaze fixed on the faint outline of frost along the glass, listening not for sound, but for absence, and it was only then she realized the storm had quieted, not entirely gone, but no longer pressing against the walls with the same relentless force. She rose carefully, dressing with quiet precision, her movements slower than the day before, not from hesitation, but from awareness, as though each moment now held weight that had not existed before. When she stepped into the corridor, the air felt different, not warmer, but less restrained, the candles no longer flickering as though guarding something unseen, and as she walked, her steps carried her not toward the dining room, nor toward the entrance, but toward the great hall, drawn by something she could not quite name. The fire had been lit again, its steady glow casting a softer light than before, and for a brief moment she stood at the edge of the room, taking in the quiet, the stillness that no longer felt like isolation, but something closer to waiting. He was already there. Sebastian stood near the far side of the hall, his posture unchanged, his presence as composed as ever. Yet when he turned at the sound of her approach, there was no distance in his gaze, only a quiet recognition, as though her presence no longer disrupted the order of the space, but belonged within it. "The storm is passing," he said, his voice steady, though the words carried something beneath them. Not relief, not quite, but acknowledgement of something that had begun and was now nearing its end. Clara inclined her head slightly, her eyes shifting briefly toward the tall windows where the light had begun to break through the clouds. Faint but undeniable. "Yes," she answered, and though the word was simple, it held more than agreement. It carried the quiet understanding of what that meant, not just for the road beyond the castle, but for the fragile stillness that had formed within it. Neither of them spoke for a moment after that, the silence returning, but no longer empty. It held something now, something that neither had named, yet both seemed unwilling to disturb. Clara moved closer to the fire, her hands extending slightly toward the warmth, though she did not need it, not in the way she had before, and when she looked at him again, there was no question in her gaze, only awareness, the kind that did not demand answers, but accepted what had already been revealed. "You will leave when the road's clear," he said at last, his tone calm, measured, yet there was a difference now, subtle, but present, as though the words were not as absolute as they once would have been. Clara held his gaze for a moment longer before nodding, not in reluctance, but in understanding, because she knew as well as he did that this place had never been meant to hold her, and yet something within her resisted the simplicity of that truth. The fire shifted softly, the light catching for a brief second in his eyes, and in that fleeting moment, she saw it again, not the distance, not the control, but the space where something had begun to return, something he had long believed lost. Outside, the sky had begun to clear, the storm retreating into memory, but within the castle, the silence remained, changed, altered, no longer untouched, and as Clara stood there, the warmth of the fire brushing against her hands, she understood with quiet certainty that leaving this place would not mean leaving behind what had begun within it, because some things, once awakened, did not return to sleep, no matter how deeply they had once been buried. The sky had cleared by late afternoon, the last traces of the storm drifting away like something that had never truly belonged to the world, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost unfamiliar after days of relentless wind. And Clara stood at the base of the stone steps just outside the castle, her gloved hands resting lightly at her sides as she looked out over the quiet landscape. The snow stretched across the ground in unbroken white, untouched, waiting. The carriage had been prepared, its dark frame stark against the pale surroundings, and though everything was as it should be, ordered, expected, there was a hesitation in the air that had not been there before, something unspoken that lingered between departure and staying. Behind her, the heavy doors of the castle stood open, and she could feel it even without turning, the presence she had come to recognize not by sight, but by the quiet shift it created in everything around her. She did not move immediately, not because she could not, but because leaving required more than a single step. It required the acceptance that what had passed within those walls could not remain as it had been, that it would follow her, not in memory alone, but in something deeper, something that had already begun to take shape. "The roads are clear," Sebastian said, his voice steady, carrying easily through the still air, and Clara turned then, meeting his gaze one final time, her expression composed, though there was a softness there now that had not existed before, something unguarded, something real. "Yes," she replied quietly, and for a moment neither of them moved, the distance between them unchanged, yet no longer the same, because what stood there was no longer defined by separation, but by something that had bridged it, without either of them fully understanding how. The silence that followed was not empty. It held everything they had not said, everything they had chosen not to name, and yet it did not feel unfinished, only incomplete in a way that did not require resolution. Clara stepped forward at last, her movement slow, deliberate, and as she passed him, close enough to feel the faint warmth of his presence despite the cold air, she paused, just for a second, her gaze lifting to meet his once more, not questioning, not asking, simply acknowledging. Something shifted then, subtle, but undeniable, and though he did not reach for her, did not step forward, there was no distance in his eyes, only the quiet weight of something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. She inclined her head slightly, a gesture both respectful and personal, before continuing toward the carriage. Her steps steady, unhurried, because leaving did not mean fleeing. It meant carrying what had been found. The driver opened the door, and Clara paused once more before stepping inside, her hand resting briefly against the edge of the carriage, as though grounding herself in the moment. And when she finally entered, she did not look back immediately, not out of reluctance, but because she understood that some moments did not require witnessing to remain. The door closed softly, the sound final, yet not absolute. And as the carriage began to move, the wheels cutting through the untouched snow, she lifted her gaze at last, looking through the small window toward the castle that had stood unmoved through storm and silence alike. Sebastian remained where she had left him, his figure still against the stone, yet no longer untouched by what had passed. And though he did not follow, did not call her back, there was something in the way he stood, something in the quiet that surrounded him, that spoke of change not yet fully realized. The distance between them grew slowly, the castle receding into the pale horizon. Yet Clara did not feel it as loss, because what had begun there had not ended. It had only taken a different form, one that would remain long after the snow had melted and the storm had been forgotten. And as the carriage carried her forward into a world that had once felt certain, she understood with quiet clarity that some hearts are not broken by time or silence, only buried, waiting for the moment they are seen again. And once they are, they do not return to what they were before.